Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. I'd like to start off today by saying thank you to all of you who sent me your Rhino Farts. I've really enjoyed getting and sharing them, and it really does mean a lot to me that some of you took time out of your lives to sit down and draw these amazing pictures for me. I will be using one of them as a permanent avatar in the future, and to help me decide, I will be setting up a poll for everyone to give their input. It's not too late to get yours in the running if you're still interested. I will probably start the poll next Friday. Anyways, today's video is from the Islam Network and is asking the question, is believing in God a rational choice? I have a feeling we'll be disagreeing on the answer to that question. Let's go! Your logo. It sounds familiar. Now where have I heard that before?
A lot of times young Muslims come to me and they say that either they themselves or their colleagues and acquaintances have come to them and asked them some very, very deep and profound questions. How do you know God exists? How do you know that there really is a creator out there?
Yeah, I wouldn't exactly say that's a very deep question. I'd say that's kind of the default response to being told that there is a God. I mean, compare this to Russell's teapot. If I were to tell you that there is a teapot orbiting the sun in between the orbits of Earth and Mars, but it can't be seen because it's simply too small, would you not then want to know how I know that it's there?
And they will come and they will say, prove to me, give me some scientific proof that there is some creator out there.
Evidence. I have never asked for proof, just evidence. Mathematics is the only field which deals in proof, so if there is some equation that can demonstrate the existence of a God, then that might be called a proof, but otherwise it's just evidence. There is no proof for the theory of gravity, there is a body of evidence. New evidence can potentially overturn previous conclusions, which is why we look for evidence rather than proof. The word proof implies that it is not subject to change.
Now, this is, of course, a very deep and philosophical question, goes back millennia from the very beginning of times. And of course, in a 3-minute YouTube clip, there's only so much that we can talk about.
The question of whether or not God exists is definitely a deeper question than how do you know God exists? And yes, it has gone back for thousands of years. And in these thousands of years, nobody has once developed a more than superficially compelling argument in favor of God. The main argument that keeps coming back seems to be the God of the gaps, whereby if you don't know the answer to something, it must have been God. You don't understand something? God. If you look at the history of science, the God of the gaps is definitely not a compelling argument. I mean, Newton was a pretty smart guy. He was the first to describe the laws of motion, but he couldn't account for the orbit of Mercury. The general conclusion at the time was that God was keeping Mercury where it was for reasons unknown. I mean, he does work in mysterious ways after all. So when Einstein's theory of relativity explained it in a naturalistic sense, God lost that gap. Every day there are fewer and fewer gaps for God to live in, so why should we look at something that we don't know the answer for yet and assume it must be God? Science would never have gotten us to where we are today if everyone just accepted we don't know, therefore God did it.
Nonetheless, from an Islamic perspective, we can flip the question around and say that, in fact, what type of proof do you need other than each and every proof out there?
What proof out there? Are you seriously just going to go with the just look around you and see how cool stuff is, therefore God argument? That one's definitely not very convincing. It's like the teleological argument's deformed little brother.
So from the Islamic perspective and paradigm, the proofs for the existence of a creator are so numerous that to begin to enumerate them is in fact nonsensical.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I don't need to know what number you want to arbitrarily attach to your evidence. I just want to see the evidence. I mean, call it number squiggly delta 9F7 if you like. Just show it to me. I don't really think there's a court of law out there that would ever throw out Exhibit A on the grounds that there are more exhibits than there are letters of the alphabet. And likewise, I will not throw out your evidence just because you don't know what number to call it.
And this leads us to a very interesting point, and that is that the same information can be digested and understood differently depending on the paradigm, depending on the lenses that you wear.
I would generally agree with that statement. Your worldview does inform how you interpret everything that enters your brain. If you are a devout Muslim, then you will probably see everything that happens as part of Allah's plan. So when a series of hurricanes destroys millions of people's homes, that was intentional. Allah willed it for reasons that can't be comprehended by mere mortals or something like that. Now, if you're an atheist, you simply see a natural phenomenon that unfortunately occurred in the right spot to do a lot of damage. The problem is when people bring their paradigms into the scientific realm, everyone does it, no matter how careful they are to avoid it. But this is why we have developed the scientific method. It's specifically to try and minimize human bias. Add to that peer review, and we're doing our best to eliminate the effects of personal bias so that we can get real answers to questions that matter.
Depending on the tools and utensils that you have.
I dost haveth a spork. This is the ultimate utensil.
So the one who sees will look at things in a manner that the one who cannot see cannot look at, because he has the benefit of eyesight.
Well, of course. I mean, thanks for that, Captain Obvious. So people with eyesight can see, but blind people cannot. Therefore, God? Is that where you're going with this?
So there's something called the Fitrah, there's something called the purity of the soul, the conscience, there's something called basically the spiritual DNA that Allah created each and every human being upon.
What is this word salad that you're throwing at me? Fitrah is an Arabic word that is commonly translated as primordial human nature, instinct, or common sense. Purity of the soul means nothing until you explain to me what a soul is, how you know they exist, and what makes them pure or impure. Conscience is an individual's morality, which is something that varies widely from person to person, though there are several points upon which most people in a specific culture can agree, but even these points change over time depending on the culture. Take slavery, for instance. Most people in the United States today would be against slavery, but 200 years ago, most people who weren't slaves themselves were either for it or at least indifferent to it. Now, spiritual DNA just doesn't make any sense. Now, do spirits exist? Are they different than souls, or is it just another word for soul? How exactly do they make use of nucleic acids? And if they are using nucleic acids, shouldn't we be able to measure that?
When that fitrah is pure, when the person is sincere, then the fact of the matter is that fitrah is like a faculty that is more powerful than hearing and seeing and thinking combined.
Okay, but what is it sensing? Is it sensing things directly, or is it just using our senses as data collectors? And what does purity of the Fitrah even mean? You seem to be conflating it with sincerity, so being sincere gives you a pure Fitrah? I mean, I've been sincere in my quest for knowledge in my life. That's why I'm no longer a Christian. That's why I'm willing to change my position on any subject as long as you provide me with the evidence to support the change. Does that mean I have a pure Fitrah?
And the fitrah can then examine everything around. And the proofs for the existence of Allah are the very fact that we exist and the creation exists.
So I have sincerely sought after knowledge, and you come along and say that that should allow me to, what, interpret nature as evidence for God? I'm sorry, but stuff exists is not evidence for a creator. Stuff exists is simply evidence of the fact that stuff exists. If you want to go full Psi 10 here...
Never go full retard.
Stuff existing isn't even really evidence for stuff existing. It's just evidence that your senses have observed stuff existing. If you're a brain in a vat, then all the stuff you experience doesn't actually exist. What I'm trying to say here is...
How do you know?
How do you know it?
How do you know?
The famous Western philosopher said, I think, therefore I am. We as Muslims, this is of course Descartes speaking, cogito ergo sum. We as Muslims can modify that and say, I think, therefore God is.
I think, therefore I am can be demonstrated, at least to yourself. I know I am here, I know I am thinking. I cannot know with 100% certainty that other people are also thinking, some more than others, but I can infer it from what I know of myself. I think, therefore an all-loving genocidal maniac exists seems like a bit more of a stretch than that to me.
The very fact that we exist and the creation exists is enough of an indication that there is someone who created and designed this.
How so? I mean, humans have never experienced true nothingness. Our brains have evolved to understand the things around us. How can you be so sure that things existing requires something to make them exist? And how come this property of needing something to make a thing exist does not extend to Allah? The universe exists, and since things don't exist without being created, Allah created the universe. Allah exists, and since things don't exist without being created, Xenu created Allah. And since things don't exist without being created, the flying spaghetti monster created Xenu. And so on, back into infinity. Unless you just want to throw in some special pleading for Allah and say he somehow magically doesn't need a creator, even though everything else does.
Now, this argument is called a teleological argument. It's called the watchmaker's argument. It is a standard argument of philosophy.
I might be wrong here, but I thought the teleological argument was more in line with how life and the universe are complex, therefore they must have been designed. What you said was simply that they exist, therefore they must have been created. Subtle difference, I know, but they don't strike me as the same argument. Now, of course, the teleological argument kind of falls apart when it states that life is too complex to have not been designed, as the solution to life's complexity is an infinitely more complex designer. So again, it takes special pleading to avoid an infinite regress of gods creating gods.
It is also dismissed by modern philosophers in a very dismissive and contemptuous way.
Not contemptuous, it's just a very flawed argument. I can't help it if the flaws are so easy to point out. Can a philosophical argument really be valid if it relies completely on a logical fallacy?
But the fact of the matter is, we are ingrained to know that every single effect must have had a cause that caused it. This is the way we work our lives. Everything around our lives centers around the fact that we understand the causal relationships between things that take place around us.
It's almost as if our brains developed in a way to understand the small segment of the universe that they developed in. But let's assume that you're right. Every effect must have a cause. So that just brings us right back to the question of what caused a law. Now, I'm willing to say that there are aspects of the universe that our minds are not capable of fully comprehending, and the quantum fluctuation state at the very beginning is one of those aspects. We didn't evolve in a super dense singularity, so why should we intuitively understand it? I'm willing to say that our intuitions might be wrong. It is possible that not every effect has a cause, and the existence of the universe could be something that was not ultimately caused by anything. The difference between my position and yours is that I'm not making any assertions. I'm simply saying that we don't know yet. You, on the other hand, are asserting that Allah was the cause of the universe, which begs the question, what caused Allah? You have stated categorically that every effect must have a cause, so I ask again, what caused Allah?
And to suggest that everything around us simply came to be without any predetermination, without any knowledgeable, powerful entity that was able to create it, is so ludicrous that it is literally, like Ibn Taymiyyah said, the famous scholar of medieval Islam, like Ibn Taymiyyah said, how do you expect me to go around finding the proofs of God when each and every thing around me is screaming his existence?
How exactly is everything screaming his existence? What characteristic of everything is the determining factor that demonstrates a creator's existence? Complexity? A god is much more complex than anything in our universe, so if that's it, then, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here, but that just brings it back to God must have had an even more complex creator. Beauty? Beauty is a product of the mind. We see things that we are used to as beautiful and things that are foreign to us as ugly or creepy, so beauty is completely dependent upon the fact that we evolved in our environment, and as such find our environment to be beautiful. So what characteristic of everything is evidence for God?
What do you want me to do to find out that Allah exists? What logical and rational proof that you need that is more than the fact that you are a logical and rational creation?
Us having evolved the ability to be rational and logical is not evidence of a creator. It is evidence that at some point in our history, selection pressure favored intelligence, which eventually led to the development of reason and logic. How is that evidence for a creator? And if logic and rationality necessarily require a logical and rational creator, then we come right back to the problem of what logical and rational creator created Allah to be logical and rational. Unless your argument here would be that Allah is not logical and rational, Allah could come into being from nothing because he has no logic or rationality, and was then able to create humans with logic and rationality. It still doesn't stand up to much criticism, but then at least you aren't immediately self-contradicting.
That you can see, you can hear, that the creation around you is there. And Allah says in the Quran, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. We will continue to show them our miracles and signs in the creation around and even in themselves.
Okay, so what miracles? I haven't seen any. You have said logic and rationality, but you haven't done anything to demonstrate the idea that those are miraculous properties. Now, what about the rest of nature? Are you saying that a tree is logical and rational, or does a tree possess different miraculous qualities? If so, what are they? You're leaving me with a lot more questions than you're answering here.
So the creation and ourselves are all evidences that there is a creator.
Oh no, Muslims do that too. I'm so disappointed in you. Still waiting to hear what's so miraculous about stuff, though.
And in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَمْ مِنْ آيَةٍ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ يَمُرُّونَ عَلَيْهَا وَهُمْ عَنْهَا غَافِلُونَ. How many are the miracles and signs? They keep on passing by them and they do not pay heed to them. They do not acknowledge those signs.
Maybe if you did a better job of pointing them out, then I would notice them. Maybe if Allah made them self-evident, then they would have been noticed by the scientific community. You'd think that an all-powerful being could manage to make something unambiguously miraculous.
So Allah is saying the signs are there, but your perception to recognize them has been blinded by your own arrogance.
Actually, it says repeatedly in the Quran that atheists have been blinded by Allah, not our own arrogance. The second surah, verses 6 and 7 says, "As for the unbelievers, it is the same whether or not you forewarn them. They will not have faith. God has set a seal upon their hearts and ears. Their sight is dimmed, and a grievous punishment awaits them." Verses 17 and 18 say, "Their example is that of one who kindled a fire, but when it illuminated what was around him, Allah took away their light and left them in darkness so that they could not see. Deaf, dumb, and blind, so they will not return to the right path." These are just two of several verses that speak of Allah actively working to stop people from believing in Him. So if it is my arrogance that is blinding me, why does the Quran say that Allah is the one blinding me?
Therefore, a rejection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not come from a logical and rational argument. It comes from an emotional problem, and that is a problem of arrogance.
Is it arrogant to be willing to admit when you don't know something? Is it arrogant to want to learn as much as you can about how the world works? Is it arrogant to be able to admit when you're wrong? I wouldn't think so. I would instead suggest that maybe the person who thinks that he is important enough to warrant the attention of an all-powerful being is a touch on the arrogant side.
In fact, the fact of the matter is, flip the question around and ask a person who denies the existence of a creator, what will possibly convince you that there is a creator out there?
Honestly, I'm not sure. But you know what? If Allah is all-knowing, then He definitely knows what would convince me, which means if He really wants me to believe in Him, He can do whatever it would be that would convince me. So this is actually one of the Quran's neat little circular reasoning bits that keeps it safe from scrutiny. The Quran agrees with me that Allah would convince me if He wanted to, and is in fact stopping me from believing. Clearly those who are already believers are the ones who Allah wanted to believe. Checkmate, atheists, I suppose?
What more evidence do you need? And whatever they say, the fact of the matter is that that itself would not live up to their expectations. If they were to say, I want God Himself to speak to me. And there are people that have said this in the Quran itself. They said, why doesn't God speak to us? If they were to say this, simply ask them a very honest question. If you genuinely heard a voice and a noise came out and said, I am God, believe in me, would you, O atheist, actually believe in a higher entity?
No, you're right. In my current state of mind, I would search for a plausible naturalistic solution. In this day and age, it really wouldn't be that hard for me to set up something where a deep, godly-sounding voice could come out of seemingly nowhere and declare itself to be God. The more rational explanation is that someone hid speakers around and was speaking through them. If the voice were capable of responding, then clearly there's a feed that allows the person speaking to hear me and respond appropriately. I'm sure there are other possible explanations, but that was my first thought.
Or would you simply say, well, I must be delusional, I must be hearing voices?
I doubt it. I mean, generally for one to be delusional, they must first believe the delusion. I might think I was having an auditory hallucination, but I wouldn't think I was delusional.
And this is exactly what the Quran says. That Allah says in the Quran, these people that are asking for miracles, وَلَوْ فَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ بَابًا مِنَ السَّمَاءِ فَظَلُّوا فِيهِ يَعْرُجُونَ. If we were to open up a door from the heavens and they would rise in front of us and they could see the heavens, what would they say? لَقَالُوا إِنَّمَا سُكِّرَتْ أَبْصَارُنَا بَلْ نَحْنُ قَوْمٌ مَسْحُورُونَ. They would say that our eyes have been bedazzled by witchery and sorcery and magic. Rather, you have cast a spell over us.
And if you go back a couple verses to verse 12, you get, "Thus do we insert denial into the hearts of the criminals." So these people who say they're being dazzled by witchcraft have had this denial put into them by Allah.
In other words, any evidence that they think they want, if they were to have been presented with it, they would reject that evidence. In the end of the day, the evidence is everywhere.
So what I'm getting from this is that your reason for not presenting any actual evidence is because you don't think we'd believe it anyways. Is that right? So why bother making the video in the first place? I mean, why waste your time making a video just to tell me that I wouldn't believe all the mountains of evidence you have, but you won't share your evidence because I wouldn't believe it?
It's the internal perception. Do you recognize that the beauty around you, that the creation around you, that life itself must have had a higher purpose and a higher being that created it?
So again, we're back to the just look around you, it's so darn purty as the evidence for Allah. I mean, I'm sorry, but the fact that stuff exists and we happen to find some of that stuff aesthetically pleasing is not adequate evidence for an all-powerful, all-knowing guy who lives outside of space-time and has always existed without having a cause, in spite of the claim that everything needs a cause.
That recognition is internal, it is not external, and that is what our religion teaches us. Therefore, brothers and sisters, anybody who comes asking you proofs for the existence of Allah, you tell him everything is a proof for his existence, and then move on to more productive dialogues.
So basically, demonstrating evidence for the existence of your God is not a productive discussion, so just assert it and move on? Great.
At the end of the day, you cannot argue with somebody who insists on closing his eyes and shutting his ears and covering every single evidence from approaching his heart.
Agreed. I have found it very hard to get through to religious zealots with closed hearts and minds. I have found it much easier to converse and have had productive discussions with theists who approach their beliefs in a more rational manner. These are the ones who are able to accept scientific findings regardless of what their holy book says, realizing that their book is much more useful nowadays as a metaphor than as a literal history and science book. Somehow I don't think you'd fall into that category. Anyways, that's it for this video. Happy Canadian Thanksgiving to everyone, and remember to follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. See you next time.